Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our latest installment on going through the life of Winston Churchill with the aid of Andrew Roberts' biography, Churchill, Walking with Destiny. We are into the 30s. We've fleshed out his formative years. We've fleshed out his years in the Great War in the 20s as Chancellor of the Exchequer, the lofty lights he ascended to, times where he used good tactical nous and foresight, and also times where he floundered. And so we enter into the 30s, which will see his nadir, and then ultimately his seizing upon that moment of destiny, which he called his hour and his trial, which is why this part is called the hour and the trial. We're going to go through basically his seizing of the premiership and the subsequent Battle of Britain and the Blitz, and end in 41, just as Hitler unleashes Operation Barbarossa on the east. Yes. How are you, Dominus? And how are you looking forward to this?
Yeah, no, I'm fantastic, and I'm very much looking forward. I mean, this is where we're really starting to get into the meat of Andrew Roberts' book here, and we're going to cover what is probably going to be, well, the first stage, the first part of the most important stage of Churchill's life. And we ended off last time with the India question and Churchill's reaction to that. And so we carry on from that point, and we start off when he's in the 30s, and it's the wilderness years from 31 to 33, I believe it was. That was the period.
Yeah, so in July 31, there's this establishment of the national government, and this kind of sets the tone to Depression era England and Britain, is that there's these national governments formed to try and actually pass enough, what would probably be seen as almost interventionist policy to try and stop the ensuing depression, which is kind of it's grown from 29. Like 29, I think there's a Wall Street crash and it's a shock, but it's really by this year 31 that you're seeing the long effects of the depression seeping into England, which had never really recovered from the Great War anyway. So it's a compound effect really on top of that. Churchill is not a part of the National Coalition, which is why it signals his beginning of the wilderness years.
It's
MacDonald
Ramsay
is prime minister. About to say Ramsay MacDonald's prime minister, so that's Labour, and Baldwin is Lord Chancellor. There's Liberals still in the Home Office and Foreign Sec at this point, so it is interesting that there's still some Liberals around. They are receiving lesser and lesser vote share each election. Mm-hmm. But this is a world, where interventionist politics comes to the fore. I think I was noticed early on. We see Nancy Astor and George Bernard Shaw are returning from Russia in praise of Stalin.
Yes,
because they're taking on one of these little tours. So there's a great belief in the power of a government, and I think that's kind of to get people out of a crisis. Laissez-faire was seen to have almost gotten people into the crisis, and of course Churchill is heavily associated with that laissez-faire. I mean, it's why he crossed the floor partially in 1905 to the Liberals from the Conservatives. So all of this is coming together to see him out, coupled with, of course, the India Bill, where he's seen, amongst others, to be living in the past, living in a 1900s Edwardian vision of India almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there is still interesting lines. So in October, I think possibly just for more for getting a proper mandate, I think as national government, they ran an election, and parties ran as national government candidates or not national government candidates, essentially, and they won a great majority. Churchill returns as an MP, but it was interesting to note that Robert says here, in a stunning volte-face, he did write that, quote, as Conservatives, we are convinced that an effective measure of protection for British industry and British agriculture must hold a leading place in any scheme of national self-regeneration. Only by walking in company together can the races and states of the British Empire preserve their glory and their livelihood. So I found that interesting. I mean, he's obviously cast it out. But there seems to be some sort of, again, maybe it was just what was in the air at the time. He's far more open here to the idea of a tariff.
Yeah.
And also there's a suspension of the gold standard, which
Well, at this
brought
point,
back in by mistake. Yeah.
At this point, the tariff, imperial, it was imperial tariffs, right?
It was like imperial preference, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. That was what it was called. It had, become somewhat, at least it was seen at the time, as somewhat of an economic necessity. And so, you had these, I guess there maybe were these free trade cavaliers or free trade dogmatists, but I guess I see Churchill as sort of essentially a supporter of free trade, but he understands the necessity of pragmatism. I mean, he's not a complete dogmatist. I don't see it as him just sort of being a weather vane, a political weather vane. I see it as him conceding certain principles to the circumstances of the time. I just wanted to note briefly that the Liberal Party, yes, so their vote share was falling rapidly with each ensuing election, and they would never ever become a significant electoral party again, and that was occasioned by the split between David Lloyd George and Herbert Asquith in the midst of the First World War. And that was sort of that was the death knell of the Liberal Party. But I don't think we noted it last time. So for those who aren't exactly sure as to why the Liberal Party collapsed, that was sort of the root of it. And then you had Labour expand from the activist wing of the Liberal Party, well, the sort of allied with the Liberal Party essentially, to its own electoral force, and sort of a lot of the hard left activists who were sort of on the fringes of the Liberal Party moved over, and that was it basically. But anyway, so yeah, just to set the scene a little bit, and that's about it. That's all I have to say for that.
Yeah, you can see that is quite an interesting divide, like the Asquith into Lloyd George succession, a split in the minds of liberal England that was never to be rejoined together again. So all of this happens. I don't think it's a largely successful national government. The depression carries on for numerous years. I don't think it's seen to have been dealt with well by them, more largely. But Churchill personally has very little to do with it. He's in New York and gets knocked over on Fifth Avenue in December 31.
Oh, is that in 31?
Yeah. And has to be hospitalized. He comes quite close to death at that point. Just another moment. I mean, we already said he get bullets whistling right past him. It's where was that, in Hispaniola, or was it Cuba? And
it was in Cuba. He wrote it in the book Savrola, and then it also happened to him during the First World War.
I was about to say down in the trenches. Yeah. So this is another instance where he becomes close to death, but it's not to be so. And also in 1932, he's touring the States. He always has this affinity with it. Of course, it was his mother from there, so he feels somewhat to have a natural affinity with the US. But I did notice that he was quoted when he was doing this tour. So I don't believe we shall see another great war in our time. But I think that was possibly just an appeasement to French crowds.
No, I think he actually legitimately thought that.
So that's going to change quite drastically, though, because we're already in 32. I mean, what's the big change, I suppose, is the rise of Hitler, which is
yes.
happens throughout the year, such that by January Hitler is Reichschancellor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have anything else on his opinion here, that by spring 32, he still doesn't believe that a great war is on the rise.
Well, so the mood of England was very much throughout the 30s and even after, throughout the 20s, it was very much pro-peace. There was a huge peace campaign, peace movements. There were all these marches, actually women played a large role in the peace movements, and a lot of these sort of Victorian style.
Given the franchise, there's women MPs. Nancy Astor was one of them by now. Just
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, and I think Britain did start rearming, if reluctantly, in about, I think it was 33. But they, I don't know if
they did a bit so under the hood or something to their voter share. They kind of hid it in the speeches, That's the impression I got.
Well, because the public, it would have been an enormous backlash if the public was, but I don't see it as them sort of understanding that a war was coming and then hiding that from the public and pretending to be pacifist. I mean, if that were the case, then you wouldn't have had this nonsense with appeasement. I mean, what I think happened was that I don't think there were, even Churchill at this point actually thought that there would be a full-scale Second World War. I think that they acknowledged the possibility, and they were, they understood that even to acknowledge the possibility to the public would be detrimental to their electoral chances. But they themselves did not believe absolutely that a war was coming. They had this sort of, most British politicians had this sort of sense of vacillation about them, not only in terms of making decisions, but in terms of determining where they stood and where they should stand. So by 32, I'm not entirely convinced that Churchill was absolutely dead set on a war, or that he thought that it was inevitable.
And you think the main changing point is the figure of Hitler, is it?
Yes. Well, he's what prompts Britain to start rearming, but
in Churchill's mind, I'm thinking specifically.
In Churchill's mind, yes, but not right away. Like, what I see is that what I see is that Churchill immediately, he had a greater, as we've already explored, a greater perception and sense of the future. He was able to take the measure of events much more effectively in many respects than his contemporaries. And so I think that he could see the outlines of a war coming about, but I'm not sure if he was, I don't want to get into amateur psychoanalysis, but I'm not sure if he was absolutely certain that one would take place. I still think there was a measure of uncertainty, but yes, Hitler was the decisive factor in making him sort of consider that, okay, this could very well be, this is one of the great likelihoods of the next decade or so. It was no longer entirely hypothetical. I mean, the Weimar Republic had already been sort of, making breaching certain terms of Versailles, and playing around with building up armaments and soldiers and everything. So it isn't as if Hitler just took control from an entirely pacifist government and completely changed the whole scene. I mean, the Weimar Republic had already been fiddling with Versailles around the edges, but
he hits the accelerator rather than doing a U-point turn on the direction.
Yeah. Right, yeah, and I think he was a decisive. Ultimately, I agree with you. He was the decisive factor, but I'm still not sure that Churchill saw a war as absolutely inevitable. But he did change Churchill's train of thought, and certainly gave rise in Churchill to a sort of a burning sense of action. And you can see that throughout the 30s when he meets with various people at his house in what was it called? His
Chartwell?
Chartwell, yes. When he meets with people in Chartwell, various generals and other people, and he sort of amasses this information. Roberts says that they didn't record their names in the books because he knew that the government was suspicious of him. They sort of saw him as a kind of warmonger, and he was sort of beginning to formulate in his head the idea that at least Britain needed to be at least on the brink of war, even if in the end that actual event did not transpire. Because And MI5, which he had helped to create in the First World War, was now spying on him and tracking his movements. So it's a very interesting period where he's sitting at Chartwell, he's writing his book Marlborough, and he's did he get into painting at this point, or was that later?
There's around this period he's painting all these young women, which Roberts tries to say there's no indication of there was actually any affair or something, but he did just like painting young women, and they also came to him for their portrait.
So I think that's rather consistent with Churchill's character. I
found that quite consistent.
Roberts is trying to cover anything up, and then so he's painting these pictures, he's writing Marlborough, and he's sitting in his house at Chartwell receiving guests and sort of the first rumblings of what would of 1940 begin to sort of, I don't know, echo.
So I want to have, you called it the pacifism of the age. I mean, that's crystallized in this. There was this League of Nations peace ballot in 1934-5, and 11.6 million Britons signed it. And also, just before Hitler's actually given the chancellorship, August 32, I found this quite interesting. Churchill almost met Hitler in Munich when the Nazi Party publicist, Harvard-educated Ernst Putzi Hans Stengel, tried to arrange an encounter between the two. Herr Hitler, Hilf Stengel said to his leader in his apartment, "Don't you realize the Churchills are sitting in the restaurant? They're expecting you for coffee and will think this a deliberate insult." Hitler was unshaven and had too much to do. "What on earth would I talk to him about?" he asked. Churchill sent an oral message via Hanf Stengel. "Tell your boss from me that anti-Semitism may be a good starter, but it's a bad sticker." So it was this kind of, those would have been an interesting encounter at that time, but it was not to be. I found that interesting.
Not to be,
He always has these quips, ready at hand. So we move into there. Also, at this point, though, I wanted to say, 31 had seen Japan invade Manchuria, and Churchill's lines towards that seem to be quite concessionary towards Japan, which goes against his idea of Germany. Now, you can call that the proximity question.
Well, Japan had supported them in the First World War, right? So
yes,
he was broadly favorable to Japan. Most of the other, at least in the 20s, by the 30s, he began to become suspicious of them. But at least in the 20s, he was very favorable to Japan, and he actually thought that Japan would be an asset, a very important ally in conflicts to come. I don't know if he thought.
Well, I kind of agree with that sentiment. I mean, they call the inevitable fall of Singapore and like Britain's loss of prestige in the East critical to his loss of empire. If you have an ally in Japan in the Pacific at that point, I think it largely makes sense strategically.
Yeah. But that also was not to be. And then, sorry. So carry on from what you were saying, the invasion of Manchuria.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that's pretty much it. Just the direct quote is, "I hope we shall try in England to understand a little the position of Japan, an ancient state with the highest state sense of national honor and patriotism, and with a teeming population and a remarkable energy." It was just an indication of how he did respect these like old civilizations, which he doesn't seem, with the case of Hitler, he seems to think it's much more this upstart in his black boots, kind of wandering around in the ridiculous pantaloons, and Roberts alludes to this. He sees him in the mold of, and we touched this with Gandhi, a mold of the fanatic, the Maji who thought he was Muhammad reincarnated way back in 1898 in the Sudan.
Yeah.
He sees him kind of cut from that same cloth.
Well,
whereas with Japan, he doesn't have such a figure. He sees it more as an honorable civilization going about its business. Certainly by 31.
And the other thing is that, interestingly enough, when Mussolini first came to power in Italy, he believed that he thought, oh well, he'll be a good bludgeon of the Bolsheviks in Italy, because there was a socialist movement. So he thought that that Mussolini would be a perfectly acceptable and indeed desirable force to hold back Bolshevism in Italy.
Yes.
And he sort of didn't really, and later on he regretted this, actually. So it's not as if he continued to have this opinion, once the war had started or afterwards. But and he regretted not being able to see the similarities, the strains of similarity between Mussolini and Hitler. But he was initially positively disposed to both Japan and Mussolini.
What do you think of this charge that his conception of India was stuck in 1900? We have this, the Marquess of Linlithgow gives this charge to him during the wilderness years. Basically, that his aversion to constitutional reform.
Yeah, sorry.
Churchill's aversion to it. Do you believe that's an accurate description? Like, do we think it was a mistake for him to not to have backed the India Bill?
I don't no. I think we, last time we concluded, didn't we, that sort of we had the same position on Irish Home Rule as we did on Indian Home Rule. And would it have been, well, from a strategic political perspective, Churchill wanted to get back into government quicker, would it have been prudent to support the India Bill? I'm not sure, but I think he was right not to support it in principle.
Yes, I tend to agree with that, but it's funny because it's one Roberts tends to think, he kind of, at times he, whilst being sympathetic towards Churchill, does ultimately try and say he was taking a wrong position on this. Not so much as what we'll get into in a second with the abdication crisis, where Roberts seems to firmly say Churchill was on the wrong side, due mainly to personal affections. So we enter the years 33 to 36, where Roberts calls it sounding the alarm. Hitler's now becomes chancellor. And it doesn't take long before he has, I think, what was it, by June 34. Okay, so he's got about a year of grace there. By June 34, we have the Night of the Long Knives, and then August 34, Hindenburg dies, and that's when sole executive power transfers to Hitler via plebiscite, in which he gets ludicrously large share of the vote. But this era, 33, 36, Roberts calls sounding the alarm. There are some quotes here of Churchill during these times. Where a band of ferocious men rise from the depths of the dictatorships, there is no guarantee for life or for law or for liberty. That's a speech to Wanstead constituents. It's interesting, these sort of speeches are sometimes for constituents. In July 34, and then in November 35, when the British sunlight fades, the jungle stirs with powerful creatures seeking their prey, which I do quite like that second quote.
I like it a lot, yeah.
It's this, Britain and British civilization is the civility. It's almost like that Greek concept of the barbarous nations being what's beyond your own dominion. Yes,
it is. In fact, I'm not sure if he was consciously evoking that sentiment, but maybe that's just the view of any denizen of a powerful empire. Who knows?
Yes, because it was the Chinese have their own conception. You exit the sort of, it's the land of heaven, or the temporal domain of heaven when you exited like Chinese imperial frontier. So
they had a very dim view of everyone outside of their of the Europeans and the whole Opium Wars and everything. That was anyway. Sorry, back to this. So
we said, Baldwin's in a position of fearing rearmament because of poll numbers, which I found interesting. It's like this early indication of, we have such a wide franchise now. The debates about Ireland and, the passing, can you kind of House of Commons pass a bill 3 times, and the Lords has to give it ascension. All of these sorts of debates, Peers versus the People from 1909, 1910, seem just completely gone in this world now, where you've got Churchill banging on about the necessity of rearmament. Sorry, it was also around this time Germany have withdrawn from the League of Nations, basically making it a shambles of a thing now. But you have Baldwin fearing the poll numbers, which is interesting because I knew the Chamberlain argument, the Neville Chamberlain argument, is that it would ruin post-depression growth by giving expenditure to places like defense, whereas it needed to revive the economy. But Baldwin seems to be, it's unpopular. And it's that idea the democracy is actually stopping them from fortifying themselves at this point.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Stanley Baldwin was a comforting figure for Britain. He was this sort of, old style, decent man type of Tory. And the British people
not
at the time,
not a great leader though.
No. But the British people at the time thought, well, they found him as a comforting presence. With this guy sort of, just enunciating these platitudes and broadly speaking, supporting the peace movement, everything's going to be fine, and we can't ever be brought to the brink of war by someone such as that, because the psychology seemed to be that if a war took place, it was the politicians who had led the country there rather than the circumstances forcing the country into it.
Well, you still see that today with COVID, and there seemed to be a great sense of, to save yourself from attack, that it could have been your fault to save X and Y, Z lives, rather than it being a set of circumstances. There's like this aversion to face a force that has come upon you. There's always, the narrative always wants to be spun that the politicians actively constructed the circumstances themselves, almost.
Yeah. Well, exactly. That's what it is. I mean, it seems to be this inability of the average person to grasp forces that range or that operate above the sort of the above personality. Basically, that's what I'm trying to say. The circumstances that are beyond and above personality, which are much more abstract and hard to sort of conceptualize. Whereas, of course, concentrating it into the the person of an individual is much easier. So the peace movement was highly intellectually simplistic. I mean, most movements are intellectually simplistic, but the peace movement was almost like it took this idea that any war must be the fault of our domestic politicians to a point of just basically denial,
enfeeblement of the nation,
like outright denial of the factual situation on the ground. And Stanley Baldwin sort of went along with that. I wouldn't say that he was part of that. I don't think he was taken in by that psychology, but he just sort of went along with it. And so by what's the year now?
We're in 34, largely.
Yeah.
We're in 34. Not a long lives has happened. Say Hitler has become the Führer, right? So kind of mixing the chancellorship with the presidency. Mm-hmm. We have Churchill giving his rallying speeches to his constituents, but he is only getting elected as an MP. As we've mentioned, he's in Chartwell at this time, and we're building up. I mean, I see at this time Churchill gets given a chance to give some speeches on the BBC against what's happening on the continent. Quote: "This is one broadcast he got given in November 34. There is a nation which has abandoned all its liberties in order to augment its collective might," he said of Germany. "There is a nation which, with all its strength and virtues, is in the grip of a group of ruthless men preaching a gospel of intolerance and racial pride, unrestrained by law, by parliament, or by public opinion." Now, of course, you have to know he's broadcasting this across BBC, so he will add like the public opinion piece there. But of course, as we just stated, he didn't want to be towed entirely by public opinion. That law and Parliament came first there, which I think is still telling to his mindset.
Yes, yes, absolutely, and that actually that's an interesting subtlety you point out. I mean, that the order of his formulation in sort of a descending levels of importance, and that sort of is like a glimpse into his political philosophy, or his Weltanschauung, or whatever, however, so yeah, that's interesting. Now, John Reith, the head of the BBC, disliked Churchill, and that's why Churchill was not allowed to do too many broadcasts, not only because of the fact that there was a general sense of disapprobation towards perceived warmongers like Churchill, but John Reith in particular had a personal distaste for Churchill, and I think it was rather broadly mutual. Andrew Roberts says that Churchill had always disliked the BBC because he regarded it as institutionally left-wing. And it's funny, Churchill regarded the BBC as institutionally left-wing in the 1930s.
In the 30s.
So, that's, I just, that was an amusing, I'm sure Roberts knew what he was doing when he added in that. That sort of extra bit of detail. That was hilarious.
On the week, this new GB News channel is launched in the UK as well. So it's,
with Mr. Neil, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Though I do confess I haven't seen any of it. I don't usually watch rolling news channels like that.
No. They're ghastly. But anyway.
So March 35. We go into 35. Hitler rejects Versailles. He creates the Luftwaffe. This is kind of critical to Churchill's. We know he's wary of war, but in a more granular detail, he has these visions of air raids. He has a vision of the war in the skies, particularly. And this creation of the Luftwaffe links in with that. He said Robert says that Churchill believed that 30 or 40,000 Londoners would be killed or maimed in a week of bombing. And so this is where his foresight comes across, that he's not thinking about people stuck in the mud. He doesn't have these visions of the Great War being replayed. It's going to be a war of bombings and air raids.
It's totally different. So the technological development in the gloaming hours of the Great War, you saw hints of what a future war might look like, because aircraft were used in the Great War, but not in this manner of flying over cities and bombing them. And so the you just see the glimmering of the potential of what aircraft could do towards the end of the First World War. And a part of the main thrust of the peace campaign in the 1930s, the peace movement in Britain, which is the largest pacifist movement in all of Europe, and the main thrust of it was the devastations of bombing. And this had entered into the public consciousness. It wasn't just something that the government was considering. It wasn't just something that a technological development that was only being discussed around, amaranth tables in Mayfair and the Saint-Germain-des-Prés. No, this was really something that had entered the public consciousness. There was almost an irrational. I mean, the fear of bombing is not exactly irrational. I don't want to present it like that, but there was a sense of like hysteria, exactly. Paralyzing hysteria amongst the populace that of the potential devastations of bombing, and what people thought the bombs would do to them and would do to the city of London were actually much worse than what the Blitz ended up being in the end. Although it was horrible, the Blitz was horrible. No one's denying that, but the conceptions or the ideations of what it could have been were much more lurid before the war. And the main thrust of the peace campaign was, well, if you don't want to feel, get blown to bits and see everyone around you get blown to bits and see everyone in the country die because have like 3 survivors left because every single building is going to be leveled by bombs, you'd better be dead set against war, and you'd better make sure that your local MP knows so that he
to be fair to that vision, I do recall seeing the pictures, not of London, but like Rotterdam, for instance, does get flattened. Right, there are cities in Europe, Warsaw at the end of the war. Okay.
Oh yeah,
But
and the German cities too.
There are cities which do actually get this vision enacted upon them.
Yeah.
Would you not say?
Well, would I not say? I mean, I still think the level of hysteria was. I think the hysteria was overstated by the peace campaigners. But yeah, it's not. I wouldn't exactly call it unfair to fear bombs in the end, and to be overly fearful of them. Dresden, was it Dresden and Hamburg and some of those other cities got utterly, ravaged by the Royal Air Force towards the end, which is a great strategic move. But anyway, we'll go into that. But a horrible human cost by Britain. But that was later on. But yeah, so I guess there were cities that that experienced a worse fate than London. So
Yeah. So okay, fair enough. I still think that maybe I haven't read up on the level of hysteria, but I still think there's a warrant of accuracy into that fear. Like I think a lot of Europe was leveled during the 6 years, 39 to 45, but in 35 we still have like a few these acts that keep happening to show that Churchill's sinking lower and lower, in terms of just. If you were to view the life as a narrative, right, which is kind of what we're trying to do. 35, the India Bill actually passes, giving the provincial government to India under a British aegis. And then Italy invades Abyssinia, and then there's an election campaign. And in the midst of all this, again, you just have Baldwin, quote, "I give you my word," this is to the British people, "there will be no great armaments." Whereas Churchill lauded the past 4 years of steady and stable progress, but he argued last time you voted for national sovereignty, now is national safety. The world is divided between governments who own the peoples and the peoples who own the governments, which is kind of a jibe at probably at Baldwin's own position.
Yeah.
Free parliaments and democracy have been trampled down in most of the great countries of Europe. They have reverted to despotism and dictatorship, and all the apparatus of science and civilization can be perverted to the propaganda of tyranny. That's probably also another reason why I didn't like the BBC was he could see that, similar like radio broadcasts and all of these were being used. They're very top-down forms of broadcast in comparison to what we have today. They're very hierarchical. You have the one voice dictating over the radio towards the masses, and less of any sort of interconnection between the masses themselves. So it is this era where the propaganda can seem to be working quite effectively.
Yeah.
And 35, is it 35 or is it 36? We have the death of, it's just into 36, January 36, death of King George V. Now, I didn't mention this back in the time, but there was, Churchill, of course, is a larger-than-life character, and he lived, he liked to always have a glass in hand and a cigar and so on. He lived extravagantly. So he got on well with Edward VII, the ailing and aging Edward VII. And then in 1910, when Edward VII's more austere son George V takes over, that relationship is more sour, or it's more cold, I would say. There's less of a connection there. And now
he didn't like the letters that Churchill, when he was at Home Secretary, would send him, every few weeks or so, which were sort of they were witty, great pieces of writing, but the king was disturbed by them, and he didn't like the tone. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but now we get his son in turn, Edward VIII, coming in, who again Churchill kind of likes, but as we said, this will turn out to be another reason for Churchill to see himself on the outside of what's actually happening inside the sort of halls of Whitehall, because they will use the I forget her name now. Who is
Wallace Simpson.
Wallace Simpson. They'll use his engagement to the divorcee as a condition to get rid of him, because more largely because they don't think he's fit in the more large duty of being a king, or as well at this point you are still emperor of India as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you are a king to a worldwide empire, and I guess Whitehall ultimately saw himself not being serious enough about his position, whereas Churchill kind of just liked got on with him personally, and maybe that's something also that's
would
happening.
you
Churchill,
want Wallace Simpson as a queen? I mean, I sort of agree with Whitehall, but anyway, carry on.
yeah, you can kind of, because I was about to say though, Churchill likes talking to Edward, right? He likes these dinner party scenes with them. Churchill in these years is in sort of cabinet exile, so he's never having to deal with them on a serious basis,
Well,
and perhaps
Edward
that frustration never comes to boil, which it did for cabinet members.
Edward was an utterly charming dandy, and so yeah, for that reason, Churchill liked him. Charismatic and confident and urbane and all that. But no, an absolutely inappropriate candidate for kingship, and it was.
But can there be a candidate to kingship? I think we actually have a line by Churchill here, if I can find it. You carry on while I try to find this.
Oh sure. Well,
can there be a
no?
candidate?
I mean not technically. Well, not nominally, I suppose. Yes, nominally, there's no such thing as a candidate. It's the heir, and that's sort of it. Unless you have an elective monarchy, as in the United States, and then it's called a president, and there's a term served. But anyway,
and they can still use this this reason about the divorcee to deny Charles the throne? Is that still, like, if he wants to politely decline it? I can see them using it again if a certain set of circumstances arises. Or did they actually carte blanche say they wouldn't? I have the line anyway. Winston's sentimental loyalty to the Duke of Windsor, Roberts, of course, giving him the post-abdication title, was based on a tragic false premise, viz. That he really knew the Duke of Windsor, which he never did. And here's a quote from Churchill himself. "But what crime has the king committed," he later asked, "and of the Privy Council meeting on his accession, have we not sworn allegiance to him? Are we not bound by that oath?" I mean, I quite like that. That's powerful language, this sense of okay, we got a bad king, but it's like that's the nature of kingship.
Well,
sometimes.
Yeah, so here Churchill's using a two-pronged rhetorical weapon, which I quite like, because these two prongs are completely different philosophies and he sort of brings them together almost hypocritically, but it's funny. So firstly, you have is what he's doing wrong anyway? That's the romantic. That is the romantic in him, and Churchill. We spoke about this romantic train of thought that had sort of been present in Churchill from his youth, from his early readings of Macaulay and the progress of the British Empire. So he was very romantic, and his constant he constantly burst into tears. One thing that's interesting, I think there's a very unfavorable review written in The Guardian of this book by some historian, David Olusoga. I don't remember his name.
Good Lord, yes.
Him. So he wrote, but he said, one thing that I did learn is that Churchill, I never knew that Churchill cried so much. And he said this in The Guardian review, and I actually agree with him there. I didn't know that Churchill cried so much either. Roberts is keen to highlight that. And then Churchill uses the other rhetorical prong, which is, this is our tradition. He represents the state. This is we are bound to serve him by our oaths, and we must sort of grant him our loyalty. So first of all, he says, well, tradition should be breached if it's for love, with the romantic argument, and then he says, but we must adhere to tradition by being his subjects in the next argument. So, but that just that illustrates, I think, a part of the rhetorical genius of Churchill. Anyway, I just wanted to sort of get into that.
Yeah, David Olusoga. I mean, isn't he the one, Black and British, A Forgotten History, 2016? Always on the BBC, denouncing Britain's cultural history. I mean, a man who talk about propaganda on airways. I mean, that is your case in point there. I've never seen him say or just look at something kind of in a cold analytic light. And,
no, that's not what he does. He doesn't look at things.
He's an activist.
He is.
This term gets overused today, right? This person's an activist. This person's active. But I think, I can't think of a better term to describe him.
Well, okay, here it is. He attended University of Liverpool to study the history of slavery. And then he graduated, and then he did it. So that was his specialism, the history of slavery. And then he did a postgraduate course in broadcast journalism. So, that's sort of what you get when you have that degree course. Yeah.
So anyway. we're in 1936, and we're trying to give. But as well, when I go through this is why I wanted to give this biography, but also our own opinions on it, fleshing out, because you see with Churchill so much so, like someone like Alasoga will hate him, and then you have you have the people who want to go against that so much that they end up like siding with Germany almost in this perversion of like the wrong side won the war sort of thing. You see the Dresden bombings and all of this sort of stuff. With this, we're trying to flesh out this idea of what he actually was and what he lived through and the decisions he made. And linked to that is the abdication crisis. Like the abdication crisis is one of those, like, oh, well, they wanted to get rid of him because they wanted to get rid of Edward because he was giving overtures to the Hitler regime. But I think he was just being naive towards the Hitler regime because he was being naive and aloof towards his position as king.
I don't know if he was naive. I mean, Roberts highlights a number of times in this book that, Churchill met with the Duke and, was she a Duchess? Yeah, Duke and Duchess of Windsor after the abdication. And each time they seem to express some sort of, and you could argue that each time it's due to this aloofness. Like they just sort of, they're not interested in current affairs. They don't really pay attention to the run of things. They just have this broad overview, initial sense of who the Nazis were, and then they just kept that without ever really going into the details of it. But I don't think you really needed to go into the details, in the 40s to be against. I mean, at that point,
we're in the 40s at this point. The time this meal takes place, is it?
Well,
they still haven't learned anything.
Yeah, they still haven't, and so that sort of is what ended. It didn't end, but it sort of put their relations into abeyance, or however you want to term it. But Churchill and this couple, they were never. I'm not saying Edward wasn't Oswald Mosley. All right, I mean it's very clear that he wasn't, but he was altogether too sympathetic and sympathetic beyond the point at which it was you could forgive him for naivete. So I think it was. I think it would have been highly unfortunate if he had remained king. I don't think he would have been able to do anything, even if he continued to have these sympathies. I don't think that. And to be fair, maybe if he were king and if he did become king and he stayed king rather and continued to receive the red boxes with the reports of the number of casualties, maybe his sympathies would have evaporated. But I don't think had he remained on the throne, he would have been able to exert any power over any of the institutions to try to make peace offers or overtures. So that wouldn't have mattered. That's not why they removed him at all. I agree with you. They removed him because of his dalliances and his lack of seriousness.
Yeah,
and that's pretty much it.
I think that so if you're younger and your natural inclination, which is getting more and more difficult these days, but your natural inclination is to view the collapse of the empire in tragic form. You try and look for figures that, oh, well, if they could have stayed here or there in these positions, and we mentioned this earlier, right? In part 2 with Curzon. Now, for different reasons, Curzon is like, he had a stomach ulcer or some sort of stomach complaint, which was going to kill him in a year anyway. So if he'd become leader of the Tories in the 20s, could that have set them down on a path? Well, no, because he would have been a leader for a year or something. And then as people try and look for that in Edward, sometimes and then refused to read more into it, and realized that like he's the complete opposite of this sort of character actually. That sometimes you want to instill, like he is the most decadent upper class person you can imagine almost.
Right.
Short of the fact he did actually stay in marriage, he didn't just whore himself around forever.
No,
so in this time, 36, we also have Rhineland occupation, and it's at this point Churchill starts thinking about what Roberts calls the encirclement strategy, or he starts making overtures to the Soviets, or this idea that there will have to be someone coming from the other side of Germany. I think maybe that just seeing troops enter the Rhineland sort of spurred this on in his vision. I'm not sure. And we have this quote: "I refuse to become the partisan of either side." Oh, sorry, this is the other thing we have happening here. Spanish Civil War breaks out. So we also have a section of the Spanish army revolts against the popular government in Madrid, and the civil war starts. And of course, if you know, like a lot of the British left would have signed up for what would become the Republic of Spain, centered in Barcelona. And you have these quotes from Churchill at the time. He was sympathetic for the Spaniards at the beginning, I think, until he sees that they start getting backings from Mussolini and Hitler, and then he starts to have second thoughts about how much he should be supporting them. And here's a quote when asked on the Spanish quarrel in the Commons. So this is not this is the thing about the Commons at these times as well. They're not broadcast to people. So there's a distinction to be said when Roberts highlights this quote was made to the Commons or this was made to the constituents. Right. Now, with the broadcasting of the Commons to the constituents, everything is only partially said to the Commons. There is a large part of everything that is said in the Commons is said directly to the constituents, and the MPs are aware of that. Back here, this is not the case. This is like a common speech. It's completely separate circle he's talking to. "I refuse to become partisan of either side. I will not pretend that if I had to choose between communism and Nazism, or as he always called it, Nazism, I would choose communism. I would choose communism. I hope not to be called upon to survive in the world under a government of either." So you can see he's starting to say, I hate both, but I will fall on communism. Perhaps that's like, again, it's a distance thing, is it? There's the thing of, I think he does always think of Germany as the old foe. And I have some quotes later on that. But like this idea that a Germany that had Belgium, this was the First World War idea when they were trying to make a peace in the stalemate, that Germany always had Belgium. They'd taken the territory and they didn't want to give it up. This is the First World War. And it was seen as like a gun pointing towards London, basically. The proximity of Germany makes it a more pressing matter. Maybe if there had been communism in Germany and something else in Russia, I wonder if if he would have turned that the other way around. I'm not sure.
That's interesting. Well, it is interesting. But if there were a fascist regime in Russia, would it have? I don't imagine that it would have. I mean, would it have sort of started the same sort of? Because central to the Germans' expansion, the Lebensraum and everything else was this this Aryan, this sort of fleshed out racial theory, and the Russians, if a fascist regime had which you didn't see quite to the same extent in Italy or Spain or anywhere. So if the Russians had a fascist regime, I mean, would it have? I would argue that rather than seeing Germany as the old enemy, because if you recall, Churchill was actually he attempted to make peace before the First World War. He even indicated that he was willing to make peace before the Second. And after Versailles, he believed that Germany should not, that the Allies should not, leech Germany dry and completely leave her out in the cold. And these were all Churchill's beliefs. And so at some point, so I actually think it was the particular nature of Nazism which convinced him. of this, rather than these sort of vague ideas of these vague sort of old imperial or geopolitical ideas.
Yeah, I think he's also like that opinion is molded, though he wouldn't have been aware of it, by like Stalin's victory over Trotsky within the corridors of power in Moscow creates the idea of socialism in one country rather than this constant revolution. You know, if communism had been seen to be this constant revolution style, perhaps, you know, there would be more natural expansion view,
like,
and Churchill would have taken ill to that. More so, but because you have the Stalin position of in one country, it's a little bit over there and can be at least compartmentalized almost into its Russian domain, or the Russian sphere of influence. It's like it's a mad thing the Russian sphere of influence is doing, rather than being something which is sprawling out in an expansionist manner. We can call that slightly naive, because there's Stalin had his own view of how to expand, which was different to Trotsky. Stalin believed, kind of like as a pupil to Lenin, that the only way communism can expand is through, this is the Marxist belief, that the Stalinist Marxist belief, that the only way communism could expand was through critical crises in capitalism and imperialism, which is what he viewed the Great War as, and he thought there would be another one, and then that's what he viewed the Second World War as.
It's similar to the nonconformist Whig view of history, isn't it?
In what sense? Sorry.
Oh well, in the sense that progress is achieved. Well, the Tory view of, I mean, this is English history, but the Tory view of English history is that England is the way it is because of the constancy and strength of its institutions, and the Whig view is sort of that progress only happens because of these particular moments of overthrow and revolution, which completely change the social the social landscape, and these have to continue happening over time to continue to advance progress. You know, it's almost like these different flashpoints in history, these key moments.
Well, that's Marxism as a whole, but I think Stalinism, in terms of how to expand, as opposed to Trotskyism, is one that waits for
Marxism as a whole incorporates that. But Marxism as a whole also, you just talked about how Stalinism was more regionally focused, and yes, well, the pure Marxist view is internationalist. You know, it's the view that constant revolution must happen, the world over, and until you achieve the utopian ideal,
the Owenite vision.
And so Stalin's was regionally focused. But sorry, you made a distinction. You said that beyond the Stalinist view being regionally focused, what was the particular difference between the general Marxist view and the Stalinist view of the
Trotskyist view is that of constant revolution. The Stalin view is that communism only spread through distinct and acute crises of capitalism and imperialism, which is what he viewed the First World War as. So he says you can't just go join. Like he lightly backed, the communists in Spain, but not really, not to an extent a Trotskyist would have. He would have sent insurgents straight away. Stalin will wait for a conflagration. That's the lesson he took from the First World War. Mm-hmm. That it was a large scale acute crisis, rather than just Spain wants to turn communist now, let's turn that government. This government wants to turn, let's flip that government. It's more like
So what I was trying to emphasize was that the Trotskyist view is more similar to pure Marxism, whereas the Stalinist view is more similar to English Whig history. That's what I was trying to say. Yeah.
So we enter 37. Also, at this point, Lloyd George is still around. He's still kind of talk about seeing as your natural successors or like natural heroes.
And
the country still loves Lloyd George at this point.
They love him, and he still believed that he might eventually be called upon to take the reins.
They're saying here that there was he meets Ribbentrop. No, he writes to Ribbentrop only. But you see, he's making overtures of like, I can be the man to solve the conundrum sort of thing. He is still quite active at this point. I just wanted to point that out because, of course, that was my opinion earlier that, you know, in 1909 and such, I think Lord Lloyd George plays Churchill around the people's budget, so to speak. But now we still see, like, Lord George believes he's accurate, but I think we see that it really is Churchill that's more wily to the situation, certainly, than Lloyd George. So we enter 37, and in May 37, Baldwin retires. Again, similar to what we had with Bonner Law. This just, I'm done. See you guys. Like, that's like not the servitude to the state that certainly the crisis required. You enter 1937. Hitler has put troops in the Rhineland, and yeah, I'm off. I don't know if you have anything more on Baldwin's retirement. But of course, Neville Chamberlain comes in to be premier.
Right. Okay. Well, sorry. Are we ending off here? Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm just saying we're entering 37. I don't know if you have any points on Baldwin's retirement. I find it another like Bonner Law, this strange exiting of the scene.
Right.
By him, not by me. Maybe that's
no, I understand. So no, I actually don't. I don't have much to say on that. I mean, it is odd, but I'm not I mean, you know, at that point, I think the focus at 37 has to turn to Chamberlain and the run up to Munich. So.
Yeah. Just before we get there, you mentioned about Churchill's writings. Is there anything particularly you want to say? I think there's a revelation of some of his characters in the way he views it. I mean, he's been doing the life of Duke of Marlborough in numerous volumes between 33 and 38. Mm-hmm. He has great contemporaries.
Yeah. So the Duke of Marlborough was I'd say it's his masterpiece. I mean, you know, you have the English-speaking peoples, and you have the first and second, you know, the world crisis and the Second World War, and those were also all great pieces. But I would say his magnum opus, and maybe that's dissenting from the view of the Nobel Committee, although the Nobel Committee awards for general accomplishments rather than specific accomplishments. So, you know, but I think they had in mind the English-speaking peoples, whereas I would have in mind Marlborough, and it's an extraordinary biography, probably the best biography on the subject. And if you know absolutely nothing about the subject, and even better for that. Now, Churchill as a writer is very interesting. There are so many different Churchills. There's Churchill as a politician, Churchill as a statesman, Churchill as a painter, Churchill as a writer, and I'm sure there are a number of others you could come up with. As a soldier, you know, we discussed that. So it's interesting because the power of his prose, the power of his, I think maybe it was Forster. I don't quote me on this. I'm not sure if it was Forster who said when Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1951, I think it was, that well, they sort of fudged the lines between oratory and writing. He's not so much a great writer as a great orator. And what I think he was trying to emphasize there was that if you read Churchill's writing, a lot of it seems like it could very well serve as oratory. I mean, you could just read, you know, for example, Roberts's book here, if you read it to a crowd, it's great reading, but I don't imagine it would be very exciting for a crowd to hear him just read from it. But Churchill's writing, you could, and either you could say that's a mark of great writing, or you could say, well, no, he's taking an oratorical style, and he's taking a style that's primarily meant for the auditorium, and transmuting it from that or transposing it onto the page. So that's interesting. His writing was oratorical, very oratorical, and Augustan. It was an Augustan style of prose, and he drew inspiration from Gibbon, principally, and from other writers, Macaulay as well, both in their ideas and in their prose styles. Now, Gibbon's prose style, despite the fact that in many senses it's similar to Churchill's, it's not oratorical in the way that Churchill's is, and it's clearly meant primarily for the page, not for the auditorium. And so Churchill sort of took the sonorous, timbre of Gibbon's prose and simplified it for the 20th century and added sort of a Ciceronian element to it. That's my view of what his writing was. And
a Ciceronian Gibbon. Yeah, I quite like that, actually. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. And so I think that, and this was, I mean, he used his research and his books to flesh out his own idea. I mean, it's very important, that moment in the 1930s in the wilderness years when he's sitting at Chartwell. You can say that he was meeting people. You can say that MI5 was spying on him. You can say that he was painting. But if you don't mention the fact that he was writing Marlborough, you miss a critical aspect of his character. When he had a number of idols and heroes already at this point. It's not as if he developed Marlborough as a new hero by writing this book of his ancestor. No. But in the course of this research, he was sort of reminded. He was reminded, and the duties of statesmanship and of great statesmanship sort of solidified in his head. And the writing of Marlborough was extremely important in laying the groundwork for May 1940, and for buttressing the arguments and that Churchill would use in support of war and of never surrendering, and of the statesmanship which he had already developed. I mean, it wasn't a nascent statesmanship; it was a rather flourishing statesmanship. But he had not achieved. I would not say he was a fully fledged statesman in the early 1930s, and the writing of Marlborough is extremely important in making him into that. If you like a few anecdotes, he wouldn't really write, he would dictate. And later on in his career, he did get help from some ghostwriters here and there. But almost everything up to the last volume of the English-speaking peoples in the Second World War, and I think most of large parts of the Second World War volumes as well, those were ghostwritten, but everything before that was written by him, or dictated by him in his home. And he would sometimes dictate until 3 or 4 in the morning, as I believe I once heard Boris Johnson say at one of his speeches he was giving. It was either I think I watched a video of him giving a speech in a Washington library. Maybe it was the Yale Club. I can't remember, but that was that's something I remember as well. So that's his basic character as a writer and as a journalist. He was a very important and well-read journalist. The thing about his prose, also one last thing, is that it was beautiful, and it was extraordinarily well constructed, but it was also, to the modern audience, eminently readable. There was a point about a year or two ago when I'm ashamed to say that I was reading, I came to the point where I had opened about 30 different books, and I wasn't actually progressing on any of them, because it is impossible to read that many books at once. And so there were moments of books where I would sort of read 30 pages and then I would forget. I have to go back and see, oh yeah, this happened. But with Churchill, I always remembered exactly where I was every single time, and his prose completely penetrates, the membrane, and really ensconces itself deep in your psyche, I suppose. And he's easily one of the greatest, the second or third greatest prose stylist. I wouldn't say the greatest writer, because there are many more qualifications for that. One of the second or third greatest prose stylist in the history of the English language. So that's all. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I actually I hadn't thought of it like that, with that like the key characteristic. Of course, he has his own father, but like this, when he's writing about Marlborough as this, I take it of like looking at the characters of the people, but actually that it was giving him the fleshing out of his own style, which he was to use in the famous.
Right. So yes. Now, so we've covered Churchill's writing, and we've covered everything up to the chapter where we're getting into Munich.
I seem to drop out there for a second, but we're all good.
Right. Okay. So we're getting into Munich. So, okay, here we are. Apotheosis of appeasement. Where are
Just
we?
before we do that, we talk about the characters, right? Great Contemporaries. I have some little lines here of how he viewed some of these people in Great Contemporaries. Asquith's mind opened and shut like the breech of a gun. Lawrence Arabia was, quote, one of nature's great princes. And, quote, it might be said that Lord Rosebery outlived his future by 10 years and his past by more than 20. Of Lord Curzon's life, he wrote, the morning had been golden, the noontide was bronze, and the evening lead. So this is the sort of idea of the prose he gets through. Also in that, there's a great obsession with Clemenceau as well, which is interesting. I always find his admiration of Clemenceau very I find it a bit odd, but
Clemenceau said in the first, didn't Churchill say of him what Clemenceau said to the French cabinet in the First World War that, I will be basically holding Paris even if there is nothing left but rubble or something like that.
Okay, so it's in that aspect, that he embodied the French ideal. Yes. Fighting all the way. Yeah, the Frenchman was said through life, and it's that sense of admiration that he got from him rather than his politics, wasn't it? Because he was a Socialist Party. Okay, so 1938, Eden is resigned as Foreign Secretary over Chamberlain's overtures to Mussolini. But he doesn't necessarily join Churchill, but it's a sign of where things are going to come towards in 38, towards Munich, towards this crisis in Czechoslovakia. So, do you want to set the scene a little bit there, or?
So, like before Munich, I guess. Sure, I can set the scene. Yeah. I'm just looking at the notes here. Hang on a second. Sure, I can set the scene. All right, so about 1936, I think it was. I think we covered this, but basically on 7th of March 1936, German troops entered the Rhineland, and they sort of, there was a coordinated plan. The League of Nations was trying to scramble to create something. They wanted, France to stand up to Germany, but that ended up not happening. And there were a number of eruptions in the Commons over that. So by the time we get to 1938, where are we? Hang on. Do you have notes for this section, or?
Yeah, that's all right. I just was wondering if there's a certain angle at which you would lead us into this on, but it's okay. We're on. So the Czechoslovakia crisis. It happens around page 430 of Roberts' book. If you want to hit around that section, if you have certain sections highlighted around there, but by September, right, Chamberlain is flying to Germany. He's meeting with the Führer at the Berchtesgaden. And then on his return, he tells his sister Hitler was, quote, a man who could be relied upon when he giving his word. And if Britain went to war with Germany, this is the Chamberlain position, then Italy and Japan might join in to dismember the British Empire. So there's still this idea of preservation. To be fair to Neville Chamberlain type, he'll always get lambasted as being the man in charge, during these agreements, then during the subsequent Norway debate. But I think he is far more likable and admirable than like a Baldwin. This vision of, for instance, why was he not... Baldwin was seen to be worried more and more about the popular opinion on peace. But for Chamberlain, it was like fixing the deficit. It was fiscal frugality rather than anything more like about the populace, or seen to be popular. He was trying to defend the empire in his own way, and that's the way he thought it. That's the way he viewed it. Now you can call that a misjudging of character of Hitler, but his more worldwide vision of where Britain was is not insane. It's not a stupid position.
Chamberlain, what I do have notes on is cursory notes on his Chamberlain's war preparations. Do you want me to sort of talk about that a bit? Or
is this before or after he's actually declared war? Because we're in September 38.
Yeah, this is before. This is during that. So the lead up. So Chamberlain.
Brief on that.
Yeah, so Chamberlain is often heavily censured for, not preparing adequately for war. So I don't think no one denies that he did make some preparations, because the preparations actually began with Baldwin, but in 33. But and so Chamberlain continued those, but he is. And I think Roberts actually emphasized. Roberts tends to be of that view in this book, that the Britain's horrific lack of preparation for the war was due to these incompetent idiots that wouldn't listen to Churchill. I mean, despite the fact, and Roberts points out that Churchill did make statements in favor of appeasement himself, and so Churchill was also vacillated on the issue a little bit, but he sort of downplays that and makes it seem almost as if he was the only voice of reason in this sort of howling storm of short-sightedness. But the extent to which Britain was unprepared for the war was largely over-exaggerated by maybe by Roberts, but by a number of other historians in particular. And of course, Chamberlain made reasonably adequate preparations. I mean, everything was, if armaments had been ramped up earlier, certainly Britain would have been more prepared, but there is absolutely no way that Britain could have got through that first stage of the war without Chamberlain's preparations. And of course, Churchill was much more vital to that first stage than Chamberlain was. There's no doubt about it. Well, at least once he becomes prime minister. But this idea that Chamberlain was sort of, he sort of thought, oh yeah, well, Munich is like, the one saving, it'll save everything, and nothing else matters. I don't need to make preparations. That idea is basically bunk. I mean, he was an optimist, but he was not just leaving Britain defenseless in the face of this this insane Nazi threat, which he did view as a threat also. I mean, he wasn't positively disposed to them either. So anyway, yeah. Yeah,
no, he viewed Hitler almost, Robert says, from like the point of a snob almost. Apart from the snobbery and prudery, it was clear that Chamberlain believed Hitler's assurances that after the Rhineland, Austria, and now the Sudetenland, there would be no more territorial claims. But there was, I'm not sure if it was Roberts or somewhere else that I read, Chamberlain, when he first saw Hitler, actually thought he was a valet or something, and didn't realize that he was, until just the last second, that he was in front of the Fuhrer himself, because he just thought he looked of the lower classes, so to speak. He did have that sort of snobbish view of it.
It's funny. I mean, Chamberlain refused a knighthood, so I wouldn't really think of him as a snob in that sense, but maybe...
his father, Joseph, we talked about in earlier editions of this, came from the industrial class, right? His uncle was a very wealthy screw manufacturer. So they weren't from the aristocracy themselves, but they did like to uphold its standards, so to speak. So I'd say maybe that it's like, when you're not actually from the aristocracy, you try harder to even... you try harder to envelop it in your attitude.
Edmund Burke is the case in point.
So we're in 38. Okay, he has this agreement with Hitler, and he brings it back to the Commons. And that's the other thing about this agreement, right? It passes the Commons by 366 votes to 144. So, there was a whole Commons passing of this agreement. Of course, they're relying on the word of Chamberlain and all that, but there's more than just the one man involved in this decision. And Halifax at this point is already starting to tell Chamberlain, whilst he gives the Peace in Our Time speech, that he should start talking about two wider parties to form a national coalition.
Chamberlain was also suggested for a Nobel Peace Prize, and Portugal erected a statue on behalf of grateful mothers in honor of Munich. Blackpool Football Club offered to build 12 houses for ex-servicemen in his honor. These are facts that I'm actually getting from a different book, but these are just things that this was the initial reaction.
This is your hysteria of the time sort of thing that you alluded to earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And they were just so relieved, like, oh my God, he saved us, and I just find it shocking. But this is, I guess, this is what it was. And so Churchill said, this is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup. When Chamberlain came back with waving Hitler's signature, presaging peace for our time, and events, I guess. And so he was one of the few dissenting voices, and at this point he would still be viewed as this awful. I mean, probably even more so, because he was viewed as an awful warmonger. And then they see Chamberlain as this great hero. He makes peace with Hitler, and then Churchill decides, in their view, to ramp up the cynicism and the negativity even more. So they probably just viewed Churchill was viewed relatively. With great disapprobation at this point. But events in Germany confirmed it, not confirmed it completely, but basically confirmed it, because then in 9th of November 1938, there was the Kristallnacht, which was the organized mob violence against Jewish neighborhoods and shops in Germany. Windows were broken, people were chased through the streets, whatever. And so there was that, and it was a horrible event. And so I think there was a Tory MP who said at the time, "I must say, Hitler never helps," because he never helps because they all had this. Yeah, well, and they all had this great faith, and then you have the Chamberlain bubble being pricked by this event. And I think at this point it pretty much dawned on people, all right, well, this isn't directly related to the peace, but at the same time, they didn't really expect, if you have Hitler condoning an event like the Kristallnacht, at that point, peace sort of seems to shrink before your eyes, the potentiality of peace. And then 1939, we go back to the Spanish War. The Spanish Republic surrendered, right, to the nationalists. Am I correct in saying that? Was that 1939?
It's around this time. I actually didn't make particular notes about the ending of the Civil War. And then, would you have a certain point on it, though? I have some quotes from around this era, which again sort of surmises where Churchill is.
Sure. Yeah, you can.
We're in October, the sort of 12 months of October 1938 to September 1939. Mm-hmm. This is from November 38. Yeah, are we going to make a supreme additional effort to remain a great power, Churchill? Mm-hmm. Or are we going to slide away into what seems to be an easier, softer, less strenuous, less harassing courses with all the tremendous renunciations which that decision implies? So this is the kind of tragedy of where Churchill views the empire by the end of his death, and where he's viewing it at this moment is inaction is dissolution in his eyes.
Yes.
Some have labeled action, post hoc have labeled action as dissolution. But I think, as we said here, even Chamberlain was resigned to a declaration of war having to occur.
Yes.
And then other quotes he has. And he's still working in the civilizational sphere, right? Everything is from the precept that the British Empire is its own civilization. Let this man search his own heart. This is from great contemporaries. And conscience, before he accuses anyone of being a warmonger. A whole peoples of the British Empire and French republics earnestly desire to dwell in peace side by side with the German nation. But they are also resolved to put themselves in a position to defend their rights and long-established civilizations.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like peace, but I need to establish my own rights to my own civilizations. Mm-hmm. And it was around this time, Robert says that it was the first time, November 38, Hitler actually starts calling Churchill the warmonger.
Yes.
So he's seen sort of as also this time Churchill still is like the last of the Victorians. Robert's noted notes by this time, T.E. Lawrence is gone, 35 in 1935, only aged 46.
Mm-hmm.
George
Churchill unveiled a
Birkenhead,
monument
58 in
for him.
1930. Yes, and I think gave some speeches about Germany when he was unveiling it, if I recall. But basically, all of the people of the First World War, all these heroes of the First World War, were kind of dying away. None of them, though it was premature with Lawrence, there was this shifting of the age, except Churchill was this one who seemed to have lasted right up to the brink. April 39, we have Mussolini invading Albania, and again Churchill's response is sort of like, well, where was the fleet? And this brings you back to his vision, around the Dardanelles of the First World War. But
then, and before that, the 13th of March, the German army occupied Prague.
Yeah, I mean, that's the complete slap in the face to Munich, isn't it?
Yeah, that was a complete violation of the Munich Agreement. And now 87% in, I think, the UK, it would have been Gallup poll here, favored an alliance of Britain, France, and Russia, but 55% still trusted Chamberlain, and much of the press continued to favor appeasement, with the Daily Telegraph being the one dissenting voice amongst that press corps. And the proprietor also was, harshly criticized by Chamberlain because of that. But so that's just the other elements. Sorry, you wanted to carry on?
No, I just have to. So we talked about, maybe the peace, right? The Munich Agreement is the complete attempt for peace within the bounds of practical politics.
Yeah.
Right. But there's still the question of, right, the British Empire is going to get carved up fairly quickly, considering its size and influence following this war.
Yeah.
So there's the question of, like, how are you trusting your allies? And I have some quotes here. This is before the war. I just thought it was interesting to highlight them. May 39. When it looked as if Chamberlain and Halifax were not only doubtful about Russia's offer of a triple alliance with Britain and France, but actually about to turn it down, preferring to stay close to Poland, Churchill exploded in the Commons. Of His Majesty's government, having neglected our defences for a long time, having thrown away Czechoslovakia, with all that Czechoslovakia meant in military power, of course that's where the Skoda factory was, having committed us without examination to the technical aspects of the defence of Poland and Romania, now reject and cast away the indispensable aid of Russia, and so lead us in the worst of all ways into the worst of all wars. They will have ill-deserved the confidence, and I will add the generosity, with which they have been treated by their fellow countrymen. Is this a sort of false hope in Russia? Whereas, like, Russia itself had to possibly cease to exist, right? He's still talking about Russia here, but there is the Soviet Union with Stalin in charge. So there's that question of, like, what is his concept of Russia as an ally going into this moment? Well, I'm not sure I'm looking for an answer. I think it's just an interesting thing to think about.
It is interesting. I mean, he certainly knew that the communists, from an ideological standpoint, would, not really be favorable towards the rise of a great fascist power. From a geopolitical standpoint, he knew that Germany was a huge imperial threat to the Soviet Union. And, I think those two things were pretty much enough to say. And he personally thought, and I happen to, you can make various judgments. Some people make the judgment based on lives lost, so, body count. Some people make the judgment based on the viciousness of the ideology. I sort of stand with Churchill. I generally think that a Nazi hegemony would have been worse than a Soviet hegemony, although both, obviously, as he says, would have been awful. And so he decides to make his stand. So for those reasons, it's the personal conviction, the geopolitical and the ideological considerations that he decides to side with the Soviet Union. And I think, broadly speaking, it was the right decision. Yeah.
And then we also have, this is his position on the US, which, as we said, is a bit more closely affiliated with his romantic vision. Supposing, as I do not for one moment suppose, that Mr. Kennedy were incorrect in his most tragic utterance, then I for one willingly lay down my life in combat rather than, in fear of defeat, surrendered to the menaces of the most sinister men. It will then be for you, for the Americans, to preserve and maintain the great heritage of the English-speaking people. So you always see, I don't know how you feel about how the Americans have dealt ultimately with that passing of that heritage.
Well,
But that's certainly how he felt.
he did this, and then this sort of, I guess he says this, and then you hear echoes of this in this idea of, if the British Empire fails, it'll be up to the American, in his most famous speech, which I think maybe, I'm not sure if we'll get to quote it this time around, but we'll certainly at some point quote that speech, where he says that in the final section where he sort of says that if I'm not
this island should fall. Yeah, well, I think we can get to it. Yeah. Let's plow through some of the facts here, right? So we're entering summer 1939. Chamberlain still believes that by this time, if he lets now we both know that something's looming. He thinks that if he lets Churchill into his cabinet, still at this point, it is tantamount to political suicide. But and then we enter August, and there's this parliamentary recess. Chamberlain goes off to Scotland on a holiday, meanwhile Churchill's visiting the Maginot Line, which is interesting juxtaposition of the two characters there. Yeah, and then
that's just sort of a metaphorical. It just shows the retirement. Like Chamberlain's already retired at this point. Like he has. Yeah, I think that withdrawal to Scotland is pretty indicative of things to come.
They try to make overtures to the Soviet Union, but of course, it's at this point that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is being hashed out, and eventually that leaks out. So on the 24th of August, that leaks out. Parliament is drastically recalled, and then a week later, Hitler invades Poland, 1st of September 1939. And then Churchill is almost immediately offered a place in a war cabinet.
Yeah. As the First Lord of the Admiralty, right?
Yes, he returns to the Admiralty. I think at this point he has a guy called Sir Dudley Pound as First Sea Lord, who Robert says is actually a man who could say no sometimes to Churchill's wants or prevarications, which was probably good. I mean, it seems to be a better character than Fisher that we had in the First World War, who came in, if you recall. It was in the 70s. I do. Yeah, helped the blundering into the Dardanelles.
Yeah, Fisher was
also at this point, I think just interesting, like we talked about the First World War, how did Churchill seize the moment of getting the Admiralty? He used that cabinet position as more than simply a mouthpiece for the First Sea Lord. And similarly, we see him making not the exact same move, of course, but like similar moves of actually making sure the real communications of power go through him. He gets a direct line of communication with Roosevelt, which Chamberlain knows of, but it's not a direct prime minister to president line. It goes through Churchill. We see the British Expeditionary Force is dispatched, and then Churchill, he has these early proposals. Churchill invariably took the most aggressive stance in any of these early proposals.
Yes.
He talked about bombing Germany immediately. Quote, he didn't see why the disgusting stentorian slumber of the Boche should remain undisturbed. I mean, these are some quotes here which you have to indicate the Germanophobe, or maybe it's just if you're being kind, it's the war switch, right? We kind of had this in the First World War. We talked about where he was feeling so jolly, so giddy in the early part of the late 1914, early 1915 months before
glorious
Gallipoli.
War.
That's the quote. Yeah, this glorious war. You're seeing a sort of similar attitude of he's in his element here, and I think there's even an admittance of the sheer activity that he wants to conduct within the war cabinet has people like Halifax and others realizing that power is accumulating around him by the fact he's doing sheer activity or even advocating these positions, which sometimes aren't necessarily the right one to advocate or otherwise, but he was testing what could be practically done. which is better than twiddling your thumbs and not really doing much. I don't know if you have anything else to say before we get into the Norway debate. I mean, at the early point, he is already talking about Norway in late 1939.
So London was actually pretty well prepared. Most London children had already been evacuated. So when we think of the great evacuations during the Blitz, in fact, the largest evacuations took place in 1939, before London was under any direct threat, and so and the people evacuated during the Blitz itself were sort of a minority. They were sort of some of the people who were left, but the largest evacuations took place before that. The animals from the zoo had also been evacuated, and this was all before war, like a few hours before war, on the 3rd of September, before they were officially at war with the Nazis. So most of the population, I think, at this point, by 1939, favored war. They understood that it was necessary. But it's extraordinary, really, to see the largest, as we spoke, the largest pacifist movement in one of the largest, certainly, pacifist movements in Britain, the largest mass movement, in Europe, and the largest mass movement in Britain between the wars, just totally collapse. There wasn't, at this point, like, the public had basically fallen into line, and I wouldn't put that down to propaganda or whatever else you want to call it, because the BBC was on the side of the appeasers until 1938. So it's interesting how the British public almost seems to have. I usually don't give the public much credit, but in this particular case, it's very, like, the peace movement, which seemed to have, had its claws very firmly embedded in the British earth, seems to have, collapsed in a great cloud of dust, and now the population was ready. And the war psychology was setting in. They were steeling themselves. The clouds were darkening. So here we are. Yes.
Yeah. So Churchill notes that he wanted to stop the flow of iron ore from Narvik and Norway to Germany by infringing on the neutrality of Norway. And Halifax, still at this point, these early months, is kind of, he doesn't want to be seen to be the one invading neutral territory, and the relationship with the neutral countries, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, is kind of key to his thinking. But Churchill was willing himself, though not through, he couldn't get the ascension of a true cabinet, that bugger to the sort of so-called neutrality of these places. We need to secure them if we're going to achieve victory.
Right.
There's a kind of, there's a months of the phony war where the army stationed at the Franco-Belgian border, the RAF dropped leaflets over Germany basically during this time. Churchill's quite active in on the seafront, though, I believe, with the U-boats, not himself personally, but he is of the Admiralty. I think there is still, like, it's not a phony war from a naval perspective.
No, but I was going to say, did Churchill want to invade the port of Narvik, or did he just want to blockade it? I mean, I suppose it would be the same thing, wouldn't it? I mean, or did he just want to blockade the sea, or did he want to actually
possibly it was just mine the sea, was it? But I think certainly he's not, he would do whatever was necessary, I think, the mining of the sea would have sufficed. I mean, that was my reading into it.
But right. So then, do you want to advance? So then, the 9th of April, 1940, the Germans decide to invade Norway.
Yes. So I'm just looking at some of the build-up to this Norway piece.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. You still wanted to? I thought.
No. Well, I'm just going through my notes here. I'm seeing. So we have similar iterations by Churchill that he would rather communism than Nazism. We get to Russia had already attacked Finland at this point as well. We're talking about how to set up an alliance with the 30th of November. Russia attacks Finland. This has been resolved, I think, by March 1940, but nevertheless this prompted Churchill once again to press for Britain and France to cut Germany off from her iron ore supply by occupying the massive Gällivare iron ore field in Sweden and the Norwegian part of Narvik. The cabinet, guided by Halifax against December, turned against this idea because of the neutrality in place. Mm-hmm. So then we get to the springtime in the 40s. Sorry, in 1940. See if I have any particular quotes on this. 4th of April. Here we have it. 4th of April, Chamberlain made a speech about the war situation in which he simply said of Hitler, "One thing is certain, he has missed the bus." Churchill told the French that Britain would go ahead with the mining of Narvik, and the operation was called Operation Wilfred, as it was codenamed, scheduled for the 8th of April, as you said. But it turned out that was only a matter of hours before Hitler had launched Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Denmark and Norway at dawn, 9th of April.
Yeah, it was a great surprise. Now, one strategic kernel, which I'll grant Chamberlain, was that the French wanted to bomb Russian oil fields because of the Ribbentrop Pact. And Chamberlain believed that the Hitler-Stalin, more so than the country's alliance, but the particular Hitler-Stalin rapport on a personal level, generally, like the point is that he thought that the pact would collapse, right? And he thought that Hitler and Stalin would eventually their aims were so separate that they would never be able to remain in any kind of alliance, even a general agreement of non-aggression, a pact of non-aggression, which was what Ribbentrop was. Not Ribbentrop the person, the Ribbentrop Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, I should say. And so he refused. He basically said, no, we're not going to bomb the Russian oil fields because that alliance will collapse anyhow. Chamberlain is often seen as a strategic idiot, but that was an astute observation, and he was correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's the other thing. Like, could Britain have stayed out of it long enough that Hitler goes east first? Is also one of the kind of things to ponder in all of this. I mean, we've already stressed how events unfold.
Oh, and then attack from the west once he's.
Well, yeah, attack once. Like think of how the US had entered the First World War. Right. Attack when there's a certain exhaustion on both sides.
Well, I know, but see, that's an option. That is an option for the US, but I'm sorry, but I don't think that would have been an option for Britain. I think the Allies just would have lost. Otherwise, like they wouldn't have. Like I think Britain's intervention at the beginning of the war, Britain's presence was absolutely necessary. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you? It's
an interesting one. Obviously, I think that could have worked, but when you read the actual events in sequence, it's very hard to see how that was ever being set up, or how events were moving quite fast, and ultimately it was. By the time you've made the Munich Agreement your last hill, there's no other course of action in 1939, realistically.
Right. Yeah. So that's.
So I think if you look at it from a low resolution, high vantage point, you can still point that out as a possible strategy. But once you start getting into the actions of the actual men in the years, I think it gets more difficult to pinpoint exactly where that could have occurred.
Right. I suppose the armchair general versus the historian.
Yeah. So we're into the crisis, the nux of these Norway debates. Basically, we want a national government is sort of seen to be one of the ways to solve this. This is the 7th and 8th of May. There's these discussions in Parliament, in the Commons. Lloyd George is still being discussed at this point.
As a potential, yeah.
Yeah, I have it here. The King's Diary entry for 30th of April also suggests Churchill was being set up to take the blame for Norway, almost to a different sort of machination which was happening behind the scenes to protect Chamberlain at a time when Lloyd George was increasingly being discussed as a national savior, just as he would been in 1916.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well.
But as I said later, like actually Churchill had accrued more power through himself. I mean, he'd been in the war cabinet, which is important. Lloyd George had not, and I think all of that sort of stuff helps him. I mean, we can talk about how this switch happened. So basically, there's this push or some big change needs to happen, right? And Chamberlain first gives Leo Amery the option of joining the cabinet. He was always an anti-appeaser. So he gives him an option to join the cabinet with any position he wants, including that of Halifax. Basically, any position except for Prime Minister. Leo Amery turns him down. And then we also have people like Eden and Churchill. It's quite important, like Amory still turns that position. It makes Chamberlain's position more untenable. Attlee and Labour will only join a national coalition government if there's a new leadership. Yes. And so we have this moment where it could possibly pass to Halifax, exactly. And he makes this position that Robert says it's almost out of embarrassment that he blurts out the claim that his peerage disqualified him from the premiership, whereupon Churchill added, quote, "It was clear that the duty would fall on me, had in fact fallen on me." And Roberts goes into this, subsequent few pages where he tries to get inside Halifax's mind of like, was he just not up for it? I don't know what's your opinion on
both
that.
Both of them, I thought that was a great examination of the moment. Where he not only Halifax, he tries to sort of penetrate the minds of all three of those men, really, in that scene, and try to track the sort of the subtle undercurrents, which eventually led to Churchill. The racing chemicals through each man's veins that happened to mix in a particular way that led to Churchill's.
And he calls it like one of the most least democratic sessions to a premiership possible.
Oh yeah, well, it's three men in a room.
Yeah, is it 4, 3? It's only 3.
4? Is it? Who was the fourth? Amory? Was Amory there? No.
It's a good question, but I recall a fourth.
Possibly, maybe one of their
Beaverbrook or someone like this. Yes.
Oh, Beaverbrook, yeah, great man. He was became the Minister of Munitions in Churchill's government, right? Or was it?
Yeah, Churchill brought him into the war cabinet.
Yeah.
And spotted the necessity of centralizing munitions role more actively.
Yeah, Beaverbrook prepared the RAF. Without him, wouldn't have been able to function the way it did. Anyway.
But the Roberts point is interesting. If it had gone to a vote of the Conservative Party or if it had gone to a vote of the Commons, none of that would have ended up with the situation of Churchill in the premiership. But just because of the nature of it coming about in this discussion of 4 or 3 men in a room, whatever it was, is the mechanism. It's decisions by an extremely few.
A very tight circle of people. Yeah. People that were sort of just.
I mean, tighter than decisions that would be expected by a king and his inner council in medieval Europe. Like,
oh, absolutely, yeah.
It's as tight knit as it gets in terms of decision making. And then this is kind of like where Churchill's. It's like he believes in democracy and all of this, but he believes in the institutions and he believes in like even the cabinet within the cabinet, i.e. the war cabinet. This has solidified itself into an institutional pressure cooker where it can make these decisions like this, rather than being the Baldwin who is looking at the polls.
Yeah, and I like that. I like these various institutional triggers. I think they're absolutely necessary to provide a measure of not only protection from the horde, the multitude, but also to be able to create the out of the circumstances, raise people to the leadership or create some sort of situation which an appeal to the popular will would not be able to create. The institutional triggers. I think it's absolutely necessary. I just wanted to say one thing before we get back to it, which is that in 2019, when Boris Johnson was elevated to the leadership of the Conservative Party after the vote of whatever it was, 150,000 Tory Party members or something. I mean that, and before that, when Gordon Brown assumed the leadership of the Labour Party and he wasn't and didn't call an election, both of those guys hypocritically, of course, but both of those guys were vilipended each time for undemocratic processes. And to highlight that with, I don't know if this gets into the decline of the British state or whatever, but just to contrast that, and just to tell you, like, to highlight the nature of how truly undemocratic this particular instance was of Churchill. Yeah.
And so he gets into the premiership, and things start moving very quickly. 10th of May, Hitler invades Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. Attlee, someone called Greenwood, who I'm not too overly familiar with.
Arthur Greenwood?
It must be the Labour. These are the Labour members of the war cabinet. Chamberlain and Halifax enter a 5-man war cabinet, and we have Attlee's verdict. Carry on.
Despite Churchill was elevated despite his responsibility. His responsibility for the unsuccessful attempt to dislodge the Germans from Norway, right? He was largely responsible for the decisions that led to the incompetent counterattacks on land, and then and he ended up sinking a large part of the German Navy, destroyed 200 of the aircraft, but there was it wasn't very good in terms of numbers lost for the Allies, casualties, that is, and yet despite that responsibility largely resting on his shoulders, despite the fact that people like to blame him for everything, I don't think his responsibility for that event wasn't really recognized even by forces such as Chamberlain, or at least it was sort of shunted aside before he became prime minister, that is. So I don't know what that was about, but it seems like he sort of just insinuated his way, or basically just slid his way out of even a cursory examination of that strategic debacle.
Yeah. It's such a strange set of circumstances. He's gonna be the fall guy, and then all of a sudden he's not. It kind of reminds me as well of like when they were in 1916. He was gonna have the campaign that was gonna get rid of. Not gonna get rid of, but gonna place the blame on Kitchener for the large part of the Gallipoli campaign, and then Kitchener dies. Like, these circumstances just rip up the preparation for like who's gonna be fall guy or who's gonna be etc.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Such as the fast-moving nature of war, and with Hitler here, it's even faster than usual, because of the nature of the Blitzkrieg. But we have Attlee. Attlee, though, as we said, Labour would have preferred Halifax. Fortunately, Clement Attlee, who admired Churchill as a strategist, approved much of his approaches. My own experience at Attlee of the First World War and my reading in history, had convinced me that the Prime Minister should be a man who knew what war meant in terms of the personal suffering of the man in the line, in terms of high strategy, and in terms of that crucial issue, how the generals got on with their civilian bosses. The two men quickly established a relaxed and trusting working relationship. I thought it was an interesting line that Attlee, we have much of the vision of Attlee as like father of the NHS, and that's become like, coddle everyone, cradle to grave sort of stuff. But Attlee himself as a man had gone through the Great War. He had seen he'd seen genuine suffering. So yeah, it is interesting. Like, it brings me away personally from like this concept of Attlee, godfather of the NHS, to Attlee, man who actually served in the Great War.
Well, okay, yeah. I mean, firstly, I don't think that I don't have as much of a I don't view the NHS in the same way that you do. But anyway, the exactly the same way. I understand the sentiment, but I'm slightly more positively disposed towards Attlee's accomplishments, at least vis-a-vis the NHS. I don't know about the other stuff. The housing stuff was just awful. That's my opinion. But anyway, Attlee, yes, he had experienced suffering. He had been in the Gallipoli campaign, and he had seen that this was the one initiative in the war that he thought showed some level of vim, some level of, let's try to end this, some level of
ingenuity.
Of ingenuity, exactly. And he, and he respected Churchill. He as an important strategist, despite the fact that Gallipoli was seen as one of Churchill's greatest failures. And the men on the ground who participated in Gallipoli largely seem to have come away from that conflict, despite their casualties, with that view. And Attlee, if you just want a brief background, he was a upper middle class, boy, went to a public school, not one of the great nine, I don't think, but he did go to a public school and then Oxford. And he was a conservative until he began to volunteer at some sort of poor boys charity and became a socialist, converted to socialism. But by this time, he was a relatively moderate figure. I mean, and so anyway, but yeah, so he's part of the cabinet and he does support Churchill and respects Churchill. And it seems like a lot of the people, British politicians who did actually serve in the First World War, do respect Churchill, and the ones who didn't don't respect Churchill, and that's something that Roberts likes to point out as well.
And it's so he gives his first Churchill gives his first speech to the Commons, of which I've highlighted a section, and we talked about his oratory. Here's some of these examples. Mm-hmm. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: it is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. Let that be realized. No survival for the British Empire. No survival for all the British Empire has stood for. No survival for the urge and impulse of the ages that mankind will move forward towards its goal. So, I mean, that's Macaulay echoing in the last sentence there, for sure.
Yes, oh, certainly. I agree.
And so we enter the next phase of the war, which happens like immediately, straight on to Churchill. He has to deal with the fall of France.
Yes.
So we have, it's sort of like Antwerp. Could the BEF, could he go into Antwerp in 1914, comes to mind immediately. He's flying to Paris, and I think he's slowly realizing the case of like how much the French government is disintegrating already. I have some of the dates here to give an indication of this speed.
Well, okay, here, let's go. So here, where are we? So the belief beforehand was that the Allies would triumph, despite this lack of preparation, despite Germany's perceived strength. The belief, generally speaking, wasn't just let's say that we'll triumph to keep up our morale, but it was a genuine belief in France and Britain that the Allies, and because the Allies were stronger, at least on paper, than Germany by itself. And Britain, and also the Home Intelligence Report on the 21st of May 1940 concluded that the belief that Britain will triumph eventually is universal. Then the Germans have their surprise attack, and they had sort of learned something from the French had learned something from the First World War. We have to have that's why they set up the Maginot line of fortresses, but to sort of protect their northern frontiers. But the Germans learned the lessons of 1918, which were that desperate surprise attacks are what will allow us to win the war. So the Germans, Hitler and his commanders agreed with the Allies that Germany would lose in a long war, and so decided that they must shorten it. This is a quote. Their chief of staff said, even if the operation had only a 10% chance of success. This was the German chief of staff. And so they thrusted through the Ardennes, the wooded area, to cut behind the Allied armies which were advancing into Belgium. The French army their reserve had been rushed into Holland. So they were sort of north, and basically most of the Allied forces were committed further north. The Germans attacked through the Ardennes, despite the fact that it was a wooded area and there were huge, it was difficult. Obstacles, yeah. Despite the Allies didn't detect that, the Germans fainted. They thought it was a feint. The Germans rushed through the forest and crossed the River Meuse, defeated the Allies, and that led into the fall of France.
Yes, so nicely stated there. All of this is happening in the space of a few weeks. And then we enter June. We have to have the Dunkirk evacuation, in which we get some of his stirring speeches, one of the ones we alluded to earlier. So by 24th of May, Germans had reached the outskirts of Calais, and Calais shut off as an idea. There's the idea of peace terms. Halifax is more flexible than Churchill. I mean, Churchill ultimately didn't even believe that there would be a peace offering. And then we get to this idea that they need to evacuate people from Dunkirk. He also, around this time, receives a telegram from Lothian, who's an ambassador to the US, saying that Roosevelt had suggested that if the British Isles were successfully invaded by Germany, the Royal Navy should sail to Canada and future British seat of government should be Bermuda, not Ottawa, as monarchy could not return to the American continent. So we see this, how much America your friends are at this hour.
Yes.
Churchill then braced the Commons for hard and heavy tidings. But does begin to turn with the issuance of, get all the boats to Dunkirk. I'm pretty sure everyone's familiar with that. That's 29th. By the 29th of May, 50,000 are out. By the 1st of June, 200,000 of the BEF expeditionary force have been evacuated, and they'd lost 40,000 men in total in the expedition.
Hitler had a chance to destroy the British expeditionary force near Dunkirk, and for some reason he ordered his commanders, I think it was basically mainly caution, although his actual reasons to this day are debated, but basically...
Isn't it debated he just loses his nerve and he's on all sorts of drugs and stuff and he just kind of loses his nerve?
Well, I don't know. I mean, yeah, the Nazis, maybe they took meth or something, but anyway, I think he lost his nerve, and he also, he basically, that's what it was. He wanted to be cautious because he agreed with the surprise attack, but then he thought, okay, well, also remembering that the surprise attack in 1918, while an extraordinary push, ended up failing in the end, and he did see the strength of the Allies, so he just sort of said, just hold back, and the French army is defeated, but the British expeditionary force is gone. And if they had been destroyed there, it's very likely that Britain would have had to alter her strategy. I don't know, perchance attempted to make peace, but they managed to escape in pleasure crafts and all sorts of different boats. A few of them were bombed into the water, but most of them managed to escape. Yeah, the greatest evacuation in history. So anyway,
And we have the lines Churchill gave. We shall prove ourselves once again to be able to defend our island home. It gave Churchill this ability, right, to say island fortress time. To ride out the storm of war and to outlive the menace of tyranny if necessary for years, if necessary alone. And then he delivers his peroration. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until in God's good time the new world with all its power and might steps forth to rescue and the liberation of the old. Roberts notes there that he uses a little bit of rhetoric used by British Foreign Secretary George Canning's boast to the House of Commons in 1826, just to show the sort of detail he goes into these speeches, in which Canning's quoted, "I called on the new world into existence to redress the balance of the old."
Yes. Yeah, well, that's... the detail that Churchill went into to create these speeches is extraordinary. The time that he had to write, I mean, he dictated them, but still, I mean, he wrote these speeches by himself. There was only one speech in his career that he allowed other people to write, and that was after the war, when he went to Newfoundland or something like that. Or no, sorry, the Newfoundland meeting was during the war, but there was only ever one speech, and that was after the war when he was sort of going senile already. I don't know. His ability to craft these extraordinary pieces of oratory is at certain points when you see, like, he went back to George Canning and echoed this line, and It's just extraordinary. That's all. That's basically all. There's no other. I mean, it's pure awe at that point. I'm not, I don't want to become Roberts, but
falling
it is.
over it. Yes. Okay. No, it was interesting. You mentioned the style of Marlborough and how it was leading to this moment. So I'm glad we could fit it in. It looks like we're not going to quite fit in the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. We'll leave that to the next time. But let's just conclude with like that solidification of the island fortress, the fall of France. 14th of June is actually the first time he even gets into Downing Street. So all of this is happening before he's even been able to move in properly.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he's going to refuse to leave London, even during the Blitz, and we'll get into that later. But by the 17th of June, Pétain has basically stood down. Once the French had encircled Paris and whipped Paris out, they'd taken 70% of France's industrial plants out of the case. And France, basically, the government had fled to Bordeaux from Paris. And from Bordeaux, de Gaulle hops on a plane to England, sort of on a whim.
He just sort of.
He decides not to stay because he realized if he stays, right, Pétain will probably have nothing to do with him in the French Vichy French government, and so in a whim he just decides to, and he gets his wife out the next day from Brest.
Mm-hmm.
It's you talk about these moments, these decisions. That is the de Gaulle equivalent, really, of the four men in the cabinet making sure Churchill gets elevated. The de Gaulle decision to get on that plane at that moment.
Yes, but the difference there is that was not an institutional trigger. That was purely an individual act of.
Well, that's the French way of doing it.
Defiance, and yes, absolutely.
And there's this whole bit of where there's a scramble. Right? Can we get Syria or Algeria? And these French colonies decide no, they stay loyal to Pétain. And so really, it does look like they're alone. I think there's an operation to sink the French fleets,
which succeeds. Despite the fact that the French were trying to get across the Morse codes that said that no, we're trying to flee, we're going to give up our ships and we're going to be able to send them to Canada or to some other place, to get them away from the Germans. And it was a great tragedy, but the British didn't get the message in time, and they were it was down to the wire, and they're like, all right, we got to make this decision, and they did.
Yeah, no, I think that's obviously the correct decision. You can't take any chances in a war
I agree.
Like that. Beaverbrook is brought properly into the war cabinet. I think he was made, as you say, munitions and air specialist with regards to the war cabinet. And really, this is it. I mean, we have Hitler's retaliation is to launch an air attack on Britain, which I think we can get into on the next time. But we've gotten through a lot there. So next is going to be the Battle of Britain, which happens in August, September 1940, then leading into the Blitz, and a period where it's Britain alone before we get to 41. And hopefully we can have the conclusion of the war wrapped up in the next part, and sort of the legacy. We can start talking about the legacy, the ultimate legacy of Churchill after he goes through all these tumultuous events. So any parting words on what we've gone through or anything?
No, I think we've covered a great deal today. I think that we pretty adequately set the scene for Churchill's entry into the war. I think we covered his the 1930s, very well, and we've gotten right up to the point where he becomes prime minister, and all the strategic points are covered. So I think we've got it down, and at this point we have nothing but to move forward to the next stage at the end. But that's basically it. Do you have a final reflection on Churchill's the trajectory of Churchill's life from 1930 to 1940? Maybe I'm not sure. Like what?
Isn't that when he got back into the war cabinet? It was written on the wall somewhere simply, "Winston is back," and I suppose that's it, really, isn't it? Winston's back. You thought the narrative was done, but it's far from it. It needed that hour and that destiny that he always envisioned, that he would save the nation and save the empire. So time, guys.
Well, hang on. The Walking with Destiny quote. I suppose we should actually quote it, shouldn't we?
If you have it there, give it a go.
I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. That's the quote. The next part, I thought I knew a good deal about it all. I was sure I should not fail, and that is sort of the Churchill's great apotheosis. People had imagined that his political career was essentially over. He wasn't a young man by any means. I mean, he was getting on. He was in his 60s.
The likes of lesser men like Bonner Law had retired at this point in their political careers.
Indeed, and so the 30s. You basically thought once his chancellorship is over, that's the end of his career. Nice career, interesting guy, but ultimately, no, his career is over. But no, he comes back. He returns. Winston is back. He resurrects himself from the ashes of ignominy and defeat, and is raised to the exalted steps of 10 Downing Street. Yeah.
Yep, I was going to say, from the apotheosis of appeasement to the celebration of the Savior. Until next time, guys. Bye.
Until next time.